Yeah. Right. No, exactly. And we've had this very unique situation in the last couple of years where the Wilmer family, this is Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s, the longtime suspect's family reaching out to me, this starting 2 years ago after he was identified as being linked to the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling, which is one of our Colonial Parkway murders cases, unsolved until that point. And then also he was linked via DNA to the rape and murder of a woman named Teresa Howell, which is a name we were not familiar with. But the next thing I know, after that announcement is made, and of course, as soon as I heard about the announcement, I knew who the suspects were because I heard about these people back in 1988 when they were the leading suspects in the Colonial Parkway murders.
That's Bill Thomas, the brother of Colonial Parkway's murder victim Cathy Thomas, and a victim's advocate and host of the Mind Over Murder podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Bill Thomas is a victim's advocate, the host of the Mind Over Murder podcast, and the brother of Kathleen Thomas, a 27-year-old United States Naval Academy graduate who's believed to have been one of the first victims of a string of murders on the Middle Peninsula of Virginia, known as the Colonial Parkways murders. The murders mostly involved couples who were killed together on and off the Parkway between 1986 and 1989. Kathleen, who went by Cathy and who was working as a stockbroker at the time, was last seen leaving a computer lab at the College of William and Mary on the evening of October 9th, 1996. She was with her girlfriend, 21-year-old Rebecca Ann Dowski, a business management major at William and Mary who went by Becky. On October 12th, somewhere around 5:30 a.m., a jogger noticed a white 1980 Honda Civic sedan down an embankment at the Cheatham Annex Overlook just off the Colonial Parkway. The small pull-off is about 7 miles from Williamsburg and a place where visitors could watch birds like shorebirds and gulls in the water and in the woods. The vehicle was reported to be off the road and in a thick, dense area of shrubbery, only a few feet from a 15-foot drop into the York River. Both women had been strangled and their throats were cut. The cause of death for the victims in the Colonial Parkways murders ranged from a gunshot wound to stabbing and strangulation, but investigators found the similarities outweighed the differences. Each of the original cases that was linked involved a young couple sitting in a car. And in each case, there was nothing found missing. And often, in many of the cases, the killer drove the car after the murders. It would be the first of 4 double homicides with 8 victims on or near the 22-mile road that was operated by the National Park Service. The road connects Jamestown to Williamsburg to Yorktown. Bill joined me in 2024 to discuss how after 36 years, in January of that year, the deaths of 14-year-old Robin Edwards and 20-year-old David Knobling were linked through DNA evidence to a waterman named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. Wilmer Sr. was from the northern neck of Virginia, an adjacent area to the north where my mother's family had lived for generations. Over time, Wilmer Sr. was linked to other murders, some considered to be a part of the Colonial Parkways murders and others that had not been linked until then. We are going to discuss how the case has been mired by jurisdictional issues between the agencies involved and some of the challenges about the ways that these types of investigations are handled. Soon after the murder of Cathy and Becky, And long before he was on the public radar screen, Wilmer Sr. had been on the radar screen of law enforcement, and we did not know exactly why they dropped him as a suspect. In 2019, the Washingtonian magazine published a beautifully written and powerfully reported story called A Murder on the Rappahannock River. The man who was wrongly convicted was a Northern Neck waterman named Emerson Stevens. He was convicted of the brutal slaying of a mother and homecoming queen in Lancaster County, the county where my family grew up, and many of them still live. That article put forward strong evidence that Wilmer's brother Keith may have been involved in that murder. Bill is now a nationally recognized advocate for victims of violent crime and leads the 8 families in the Colonial Parkways murders in their advocacy. With his podcasting partner, Kristen Dilley, the co-host and producer of Mind Over Murder, they discuss many cases, including their efforts to solve the Colonial Parkway murders. Since last coming on, Bill and I have developed a friendship where we often have long calls about the many cases, about working with the FBI, the local area and culture, and tidbits that my family's roots in the Northern Neck offer. In this episode today, Bill and I are going to talk about the 1987 murders of 14-year-old Robin Edwards and 20-year-old David Knobling, who were murdered in 1987 and found dead at Ragged Island on the southern portion of the James River. They were the second in a series of murders and the first to be linked by DNA. We're also going to discuss the announcement this January of the DNA link between Wilmer Sr. and the murders of Cathy and Becky, who were killed in 1986 and were the first known murders in the series that became known as the Colonial Parkways murders. They were the 5th and the 6th victims linked to Wilmer Sr. We're going to also talk about Bill's relationship, sometimes heated, with FBI and where it now stands. We're also going to dive into the lives of the 3 Wilmer brothers. So, Bill, thanks for coming back and joining. I really appreciated when you came in. You were so generous with your time in 2004 2024. And it's been really awesome. Like, I don't know how you feel about it, but I sort of feel like we've developed a friendship since then. And, it's been really nice to talk to you about some of the issues related to the case, the fact that, I have so many family connections to the area. But it's just always nice to talk to somebody who's really thoughtful about some of the issues around criminal justice and who's an advocate for your family and other families. So thanks for coming on again.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way. First of all, it's always fun to talk with you. And of course, we managed to work ourselves up into a complete frenzy as we discuss everything that's gone.
We have lots of 30-minute conversations that turn into 2 hours. So my apology to your partner.
Yeah. And then, of course, Pamela, who's absolutely wonderful, she would never say, this Jason Blair guy, he's so long-winded. And she would never say that. And, of course, I think to myself, well, he's actually not the problem. I think I'm the problem. He just asks really good questions.
Well, yeah, naturally curious. They when I was a kid, they said my mascot was Curious George. So really,
I believe that. For you as a longtime journalist and reporter and now podcaster, I mean, I get it.
Yep. I just want to know why, and I want it to make sense, is what I say.
Yeah.
Do my best to make sense out of things. I think the first question, everyone's going to be curious about because, a month ago in January, you got the news that Cathy and Becky's murders had been solved through DNA that was connected to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. And, I think I've heard this and I've seen it online, and you and I have talked about it. Um, I've seen people ask you how you're doing. I've seen a lot of people congratulate you, but I know in the first conversation that we had afterwards, we talked a little bit about how the emotions around these things are really, really complicated. So, how are you doing, and how, are you feeling since finding out?
Well, it's been what, 3, 4 weeks now. So it's kind of sunk in a little bit, but it's still difficult. Um, One of the things I said to Terry Haley Holman, her sister Cassandra was another murder victim in the Colonial Parkway murders. I said to Terry a couple of weeks ago when we were talking, I said, it's not going to change your life, meaning we're working very hard now to see the rest of the Colonial Parkway murders victims and their families through this process. We're hoping that we can keep pushing for answers. But what I meant when I said that to Terry was finding out who killed her sister Cassandra, who went by Sandy, isn't going to change Terry's life, at least in my opinion. Is it helpful for us to know who killed my sister Cathy Thomas and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski? Absolutely, but it hasn't changed my life. And I'm also unhappy with the complete lack of follow-up from the FBI. So that kind of just continues my agita, my frustration with the Bureau. I requested a follow-up meeting 3 weeks ago, and I haven't received a single response.
Wow. Wow.
And so they're back to holding my family at arm's length, and that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I think about in a situation like this, I sort of think of it like, as a family member, you have a right to know. Like, the killer shouldn't be the only person who knows what happened
Right.
or who is responsible. But knowing that doesn't change the fact that you didn't have the last nearly 40 years with your sister.
Right.
Like, it doesn't bring back what you really wanted. And I remember thinking about that when the Robert Edwards and David Knobling case happened, that while or the results came in that it was Alan Wade Wilmer, that while this was going to be a good thing for them, it wasn't going to be the end of the journey, because it's just the sense of loss it's not going to change.
Right. And this is where I push back against the use of the word closure. And I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but even the special agent in charge who led the meeting a month ago, her name is Dominique Evans. When Ms. Evans used the word closure, she actually used the word 2 or maybe 3 times in the first few minutes of the meeting. And interestingly, I had just read a training manual online which tells FBI agents not to use the word closure. And I'm not criticizing Ms. Evans. She was very gracious and she handled our meeting well. But after she said it 2 or 3 times in the first, let's say, 5 minutes, I actually stopped her and said, can you please not use the word closure? There is no closure. There will never be closure. So, you saying it doesn't sit well with me. So I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't use that word. Now, because when things are stretched on for so long, closure's out the window, and even words like justice feel like very remote concepts when we're dealing with a situation where Alan Wade Wilmer has killed my sister, Rebecca Dowski, her girlfriend, and 4 other victims. And he's been dead since 2017, so he's never going to trial. There's never going to be any justice. And there sure as shooting isn't going to be any closure, in my opinion, certainly for the Thomas family. I can't speak for all the other families, but it just feels like an alien concept to me. You're just hoping and praying for answers, and it's a long time to wait for answers. It's 39, almost 39 and a half years looking for answers.
I think a better way to almost phrase it is that what I hope for you is that you find a little more peace in your grief.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And look, I'd rather know than not know. And I'd rather have answers. That's a word we used a lot and continue to use, which is we're just looking for answers. None of this is ever going to make sense, but at least we know what happened and, a bit more about how Cathy and Becky died. The why is not something I think we're ever going to completely understand.
Right. Because we already know that the people around him probably don't understand it. Certainly, law enforcement might get to something like what his pattern is, but why, unless he opened up to someone about it. You know, that thing about justice sort of feeling because of time different. I remember when I was a reporter in New York and I was running around and, as a young reporter, so you get the Macy's Day Parade, you get the civil rights protests.
Sure.
All that stuff. And I remember the chants of justice delayed, justice denied. And I remember thinking that's a really interesting line, but I don't really get what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
But I think over time, and then also talking to some of my family members who went through the civil rights movement, that when justice comes is actually really important.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's nice that the case is closed, but, you guys went so long without answers. The person responsible will never do a day. And it certainly sounds like he lived in some misery, but he'll never do a day in jail for it.
No. And at the same time, now when we find ourselves with the FBI refusing to answer my follow-up questions, which I don't think are unreasonable requests, that doesn't help. And they've gone back to radio silence now. I requested a follow-up meeting 3 weeks ago. And interestingly, they granted a meeting for Bob Dowski, Becky's brother, who was there with me at the face-to-face meeting. He asked for a follow-up. He got one. He did like what he estimated was probably a 2-hour phoner with the FBI. I was aware of that, and I requested a meeting for me to do follow-up, and they've refused to book an appointment with me. They are just not responding.
They're not responding. Well, what are the follow-up questions that you do have?
Well,
what did they share with you in that meeting?
Well, it was interesting. Let me get into what they shared first. They had arranged the meeting. They asked us if we would fly down at the FBI's expense and be put up in a hotel. And this would have been on a Monday morning. They booked us the previous week. And they said that they asked if we could come to Virginia to meet at the Chesapeake office, which is where the FBI Norfolk field office is located. And they wouldn't say what they were going to tell us. They asked us if we could fly in on a Monday and meet the following morning at 9:00. And the meeting was structured in such a way, I didn't realize it until later, but this whole thing was very timed down to the minute. They actually kept us waiting downstairs. One of the agents chatted with us for 15 minutes or so. They wanted to bring us into the room at exactly 9:00. And they had asked us to leave telephones, iPads, and other recording devices outside. So they locked them all up. And I was so concerned about their very strict security, I didn't even bring in a piece of paper or a pen, which is unusual for me because I like to take notes.
You didn't do the hide the tape recorder in your shoe trick?
No, I thought about it, but I didn't do it. And I've had a number of go rounds actually over the years where the FBI has falsely accused me of recording them, which is ludicrous. And actually, after they brought it up for the fourth or fifth time over a period of years, I actually blew up and told them, "Don't ever ask me that again. This is ridiculous. I have."
They're missing out on your great memory, actually.
Yeah.
You really do have a great memory. It's
So,
impressive.
well, thank you. So the meeting began, and as I mentioned, SAC Dominique Evans, led the meeting, and she cut right to the chase, which I appreciated. So within the first sentence or two of her introduction, after we'd gone around the room and I'd met everybody, and Bob had said hello, Bob Dowski was sitting next to me. And I think there were 7 people on the other side of the table, 6 or 7.
So Dominique is the supervisory special agent, the one who
Yeah.
runs the field office.
She's in charge of the field office. And she said right out of the chute, which was good, she said something like, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible for the deaths of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. So she didn't want to keep us hanging, wondering what she was going to tell us. And then they proceeded to get into more depth. Both Bob and I are very curious people, and he's a very smart guy. And we asked a lot of questions, and they answered some of them, but a number of them they did not answer in a way that was satisfactory to us. And there was some frustration. But what they told us was that they had retested evidence, which we knew about, that had been sent to an outside lab. I stopped them, and this is at least one situation where I asked a question and got a straightforward answer, which is very unusual with the FBI. They seem to take the attitude, we ask the questions, we don't answer the questions. I said, which outside lab did the DNA work? And, for once, they just answered the question. They said DNA Labs International in Florida, which is a lab I'm very familiar with. And they said that they had sent evidence in for testing, in this case, retesting, and they were looking at evidence inside my sister's car, her Honda Civic, where Cathy and Becky's bodies were both placed. And they were obviously looking at the interior of the car and things like the carpets and the floor mats and various pieces of the interior. And they were also very focused on the clothing items that Cathy and Becky were wearing when they were killed. And I knew that they had conducted a number of tests over the years, but they said that they sent items to DNA Labs International for retesting, and that they had discovered Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s DNA on Becky's bra. Now, Cathy and Becky it was October when they were killed, and their bodies are found inside the car. Cathy's wearing a long sleeve white BASF cotton jersey, like something a runner would wear. She was a runner. And she had track pants on, sneakers, socks, bra, and underwear. And Becky, also a very sporty, athletic young woman, was wearing shorts, a t-shirt, a bra, a windbreaker, and running shoes as well. They said that they found Alan Wade Wilmer's DNA on Becky's bra, that's under her t-shirt and under her windbreaker. And as they said, and they laid this out in a very logical way, which is very helpful. They said, look, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s DNA has no reason to be on Becky's bra. He's not in a relationship with her. There's absolutely no way his DNA belongs there. Now, Bob and I, both being the curious people that we are, we wanted to know what kind of DNA, and they refused to answer the question. And
Interesting.
this stuff I just find infuriating. I think they're almost reflexively responding, we can't tell you that.
As if this were an active case when it's
Well,
not.
and that's what I said.
Or-
And I pushed back hard and I said, what kind of DNA? And they wouldn't say. So, I mean, it could have been saliva. It could have been semen. It could have been blood. It could have been touch DNA. But they refused to say. And I just find that infuriating. And I said, wait a minute. We're not taking this case to trial. Wilmer's been dead since 2017. Why can't you tell us what kind of DNA was found on Becky's bra? But they just refuse. They just sort of stare at you. And I find this bizarre attitude really, really frustrating because I don't think it's an unreasonable question. And remember, and I've said this across similar tables with the FBI previously, I've been dealing with this case for longer than any of you have been in the FBI.
You may have socks older than them.
Now, and again, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but when I ask a simple question like which lab did the work, and they answer the question, why can't they answer more questions in that straightforward style?
And I can't think of a plausible reason why knowing the kind of DNA that was found on the bra strap, unless maybe they didn't know in the moment, would possibly affect any of the cases that are still open.
Right.
Whether it was Wilmer who did them or whether there's a living person who did it, I don't see how that would affect anything.
The one thing is I do get that, Jason. In other words, there is a strong possibility there may be accomplices in this case. Now, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. died in December 2017 at his home in Lancaster County, Virginia. But we are aware of a number of potential accomplices, many of whom are still alive. And as far as I know, they may be listening to the Silver Linings playbook in the very near future. So,
you would be surprised the interesting letters I have gotten from people when I do an open case.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, and I misspoke. Silver Linings Handbook, but you never know. So that part I get, the fact that potentially there could be accomplices who are living and could be charged in this case. I still don't think that my question about what type of DNA it was would necessarily preclude, that kind of discussion. We did discuss accomplices. I actually named a couple of potential accomplices over the table, but because I'm a believer in it trying to deal with people in a straightforward manner. And so I had a lot of questions. Bob did too. And we got very, very frustrated in a number of spots. So they continued to present what they could, but we kept bumping into us asking follow-up questions and them refusing to answer them. So there was a significant amount of frustration on our part, and I don't understand it.
Yeah, and it seems to be part of a kind of repeated pattern because I think about the broader Colonial Parkways murders. There have been plenty of suspects over the years.
Mm-hmm.
There have been plenty of theories, but one of the things for me is in all those suspects or those theories that existed, once you get to the point where the families are actively looking into things,
Mm-hmm.
and I was thinking about this in another case recently, how does having the dialogue really hurt, right? Like I could understand if, your suspects could potentially still be alive. You don't want to give up too much information.
Right.
But you think about things like victimology, or you think about things like whatever a family member may be looking into. I just don't know why they close that door off and make it so one way.
Well, I totally agree. A number of experts have said to me over the years, Bill, I don't know why they're not using you as the resource that you've become. You actually people have told me this dozens of times, and I'm talking about experts now. They've said, you know more about this case than anyone outside of law enforcement. And you may know more about this case than even people that have worked this case. And they've said, I don't know why they're not kind of bringing you in more. Obviously, they can't share everything, but they could probably learn things about Cathy, about Becky, as you said, about the victimology of this case. And we've really put ourselves out there since 2009, when the FBI lost control of 78 highly graphic crime scene photos. They were accidentally leaked by the FBI. As they always put it, a non-agent photographer actually stole the photographs and took them when he left the FBI, and he was using them at an outside class that he was teaching, which is obviously completely inappropriate in an unsolved case. So I got more involved in my sister's case after I learned, just by chance, that this leak had occurred. I just happened to be looking at the Colonial Parkway murders online in September 2009, a couple of weeks before the October anniversary of Cathy and Becky's death. And just by chance, I saw an article which led me to a television report on WTKR, the CBS affiliate. A reporter named Mike Mather was reporting that the FBI had lost control of these highly graphic crime scene photos and that they were out in the public, which obviously filled me with rage. And I also wanted to know,
not a good thing.
Why didn't the FBI contact us to let us know that this had happened? So I had gotten much more involved in this case starting in 2009. But I mean, during that time, we started a podcast, Mind Over Murder, which doesn't focus exclusively on the Colonial Parkway murders, but we do talk about it frequently. And that's why we started the Mind Over Murder podcast. And I've done television series. We've actually done several. And we have a new one that's in development now. And I know some of this stuff doesn't sit well with the FBI, but quite frankly, I don't care, because I only have a limited number of cards I can play. And I've even said this to the FBI. If I don't keep talking about this case, if we don't work together as a group of families to pool our resources and let people know that this case remains unsolved and that 8 young people and possibly more were murdered in Virginia from 1986 to 1989. If we don't keep talking about it, this case will die.
Right. Oh, yeah.
This all came about as a result of my reaching out to the other families for the first time in 2009 after I learned about the crime scene photo leak. So I don't know what else they would have me do. They've been very critical of me. And there's been a lot of, push and pull behind the scenes. I mean, it's gotten very heated at times. The FBI's actually even threatened me, which I hope people in listening to this will realize I'm a rational person and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it does not feel good when your case agent begins threatening you because you're too outspoken.
That came out of the CrimeCon tip? Is that how that came out?
Yeah. This is a couple of years ago now. We receive a lot of tips in the Colonial Parkway murders. What I try to do, and I don't care whether the FBI likes it or not, I try to develop the tip along with my podcast partner, Kristen Dilley. And we try to run the tip to ground to, get the person to tell us everything they know. And then I will usually type it up and send it in to the FBI for their follow-up. Now, obviously, they're the ones that have to decide whether something is worthy of follow-up or needs to go in the file or whatever. And I'm not just going to tell someone who reaches out to me and wants to talk to us about the Colonial Parkway murders, talk to the FBI, because I'm fully aware of tips that haven't been followed up upon and lots and lots of missed opportunities in this case. You don't get a 40-year-old cold case without having a lot of problems along the way. But this situation that you referenced, we had a couple come to us at CrimeCon, the big annual crime conference where we were appearing. And I spoke to a married couple, young couple from Virginia, who listened to the podcast, and they had something important to tell us. And they wanted to wait until they met us at CrimeCon, like face to face. And I foolishly was a little overwhelmed. I was setting up the booth at the time the couple came up to us. The show hadn't officially started yet, and Kristen Dilly, my podcast partner, was delayed by weather. So she's sitting on the ground in Richmond, I think, at that point. And this couple offered something that was pretty significant, I thought. And I had said to them, can you come back tomorrow, which is when CrimeCon was actually underway. And I knew Kristen would get there sooner or later, as soon as she could. And they really wanted to meet Kristen because they were fans of the podcast. So somehow we didn't connect with the couple. And so then over the next couple of days, we did connect with lots of other people. And we did a panel and all this other stuff. But I never heard back from that particular couple at that point. So I thought what they had to tell us was important. I mentioned it to our case agent when I got back, and she was very hot to trot on this information. Like an idiot, I had been a bit overwhelmed at the time I spoke to this couple. I didn't get their email address or their phone number. All I knew was their names. And our FBI agent just went off on me because she thought that this was important, and she was right, and she was mad at me for not having their contact info. Now, I gave her what I remembered from the conversation, which was pretty detailed, but I didn't have their contact info. And it got very heated, and our case agent, who's now retired from the FBI, but she actually accused me of withholding this information. She kind of went off on me, and she said, you're the one that has your own podcast. You're the one that's done the television series. I know you're writing a book. She accused me of withholding this information, and I got really mad, and I said, on what effing planet am I going to be withholding information in my sister's unsolved murder? Tell me how that makes any sense.
Zero.
Yeah. Now, I said, I pledge to you, I will find these people, but I am not withholding information from the FBI. I've never withheld information from the FBI. This is absurd. So things got pretty heated. And then actually, Bob Dowski, Becky's brother, called me and he said, our case agent is threatening to bring you up on obstruction of justice charges. And
your case agent clearly hadn't talked to the PR person.
No. But
Good Lord.
I said, the next time I spoke to our case agent, I said, the next time you threaten me, you need to do it directly. And of course, then she gets all exasperated and says, I never threatened you. And I said, no, you used Bob Dowski to threaten me. And this gives you plausible deniability because you can say, I never threatened Bill, but you used Bob as your errand boy, and you specifically threatened me with federal obstruction of justice charges. And I said, I reiterate, on what planet am I going to withhold information? And it took me about 2 weeks, but I did track these people down. I think actually that year, CrimeCon was in Orlando. I actually think they went on vacation, and I think they were at Disney World, which I know sounds kind of absurd, but they were there, on their vacation, and they went to CrimeCon, and I think they went on to Disney World. So even CrimeCon pitched in. They have thousands of attendees. They were actually trying to help us figure out who were these people. We knew it was a young married couple from Virginia. So I did eventually track them down. And just like I do every other time, I typed it all up and I did a ton of research. So when I went back to our case agent with this write up, it contained a tremendous amount of information that was necessary for our case agent to follow up. But it's that kind of thing where you're just like, how do things get this crazy that I've got the FBI accusing me of withholding information?
Yeah, and also doing something as they know you're looking into the case and you're doing good work on it. They're doing something that discourages you actually from sharing because, in journalism, when I was a reporter, there are all these sort of like ethical things around when you're covering crime stories and when you can and when you should and shouldn't, share with police. If I hear Osama bin Laden is about to fly some planes in a building, it's okay because there's an immediate threat to public safety.
Sure.
As long as, it's not confidential with a source. And as long as I'm not acting as an agent or of the law enforcement or endangering a vulnerable person, the really smart detectives knew that I was going to find out things as a reporter they would never be able to find out because
Right.
even on simple things like you go into a poor black neighborhood in New York City, as soon as they see the badge, nobody's talking, but they'll
Right.
talk to me, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right.
I can say you might want to look in that direction or you might want to do that. But the really smart law enforcement will leverage the people around because inevitably I'm going to find out things that you don't. And I think of I don't know what the FBI knows about this, but just a great example of what you guys have done listening to the podcast and then in our conversations is the whole exploration you're doing into Ron Little.
Right.
Because that's another thing too when I was reporting. I may not have a clue about the crime that the cops are looking into, but I might find out about 6 more that they have no idea about.
And you're going to share that information. You're not going to withhold it from law enforcement. And of course, our case was a cold case, so this had stretched on for a number of years, and it doesn't make any sense for me to withhold information. But this is where the push and pull and the tension, and I get the fact that the FBI is kind of culturally a closed organization. They don't reveal much, they don't answer questions, they ask the questions. And whereas I'm actually out talking about this case and encouraging people to come forward with information. And I know that the more people that are talking about the Colonial Parkway murders, the better off the families are, because that means that people are being reminded this isn't a closed case. This case has not been solved yet. And these families are looking for answers. So my approach and the FBI's approach may inherently be in conflict because I've got a big mouth and I've got a platform. It might not be a gigantic platform, but we have tens of thousands of listeners and people are following the case and commenting on social media and all that sort of stuff. And I want to encourage that, but that kind of runs counter to how the FBI and much of law enforcement approach cases.
Well, one of the things, jump into the Ron Little example and Liberty Security and all of those different things that you guys have looked in, which I'd love for you to talk about a little bit. You have people who show up at your events. You've had, family members of the suspects reach out to you. You have people who knew the suspects reach out to you.
Yeah.
I don't know if all those people are just going to reach out to the FBI.
No, I know for a fact that many of them are not. And
in fact, if you've ever tried to call the FBI, it can be really hard if you don't know about the operations center in DC to even get anyone.
Right. No, exactly. And we've had this very unique situation in the last couple of years where the Wilmer family, this is Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s, the longtime suspect's family, reaching out to me. This starting 2 years ago after he was identified as being linked to the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling, which is one of our Colonial Parkway murders cases, unsolved until that point. And then also he was linked via DNA to the rape and murder of a woman named Teresa Howell, which is a name we were not familiar with. But the next thing I know, after that announcement is made, and of course, as soon as I heard about the announcement, I knew who the suspects were because I heard about these people back in 1988 when they were the leading suspects in the Colonial Parkway murders.
So 2 years after Cathy and Becky, and then 1 year after Robin Edwards and David Knobling, you and your family were already hearing about.
Yes, directly from the FBI, who were dealing with my late father at that point. But I remember talking to my dad about this. At the same time, flashback 5 years ago or so, another longtime suspect's family reached out to me, and this is a family from New Zealand, the Little family, and they told me that their father, Ron Little, who was a longtime suspect in the Colonial Parkway murders, had had a recurrence of cancer and he was dying. And I got the impression that the Little family was more willing to talk about things their father had discussed with them because their father was dying. And although no one said it, their father was a lifelong criminal both in New Zealand and in the U.S., and then ultimately deported back to New Zealand. And I got the impression they were less afraid of him than they had been before. This guy was very capable of violence. So I had this very interesting dynamic starting probably 5 years ago where the Little family reached out to me with a lot of information about things their father told them. And their father had told them that he was involved in a series of unsolved murders in Virginia. And he meant directly involved. Now, he didn't call them the Colonial Parkway murders. He didn't mention Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski or any of the other victims. But remember, he's deported back to New Zealand in 1989 before the case really becomes known as the Colonial Parkway murders. And he literally lives on the other side of the world in New Zealand. So he's telling his family, particularly his two teenage sons, that he was directly involved in this series of unsolved murders in Virginia. Now, first of all, who says that? That's kind of a bizarre claim to make.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Well, I learned about this. And, this guy wanted to be seen as a badass, and he was a career criminal, and he wanted to be seen as a tough guy. And so he ended up filling his sons' heads with all sorts of stories about the Colonial Parkway murders. But the truth is, he wasn't making this stuff up.
Well, and also, where he was located and when he lived there, he was in Gloucester County. There are very few other things you could be talking about if you were talking about a series of murders. This isn't like a huge, giant population of people with multiple mass murders and serial killers. When you look at the three peninsulas in Virginia at that time, you had the military, you had Busch Gardens, had that opened? Yeah, it had opened. You had Busch Gardens, you had fishermen and villages. You didn't have, what I would say is at least on the northern neck and the middle peninsula, a little bit different on the Virginia peninsula when you got to Norfolk. But where the Colonial Parkways murders happened and where Ron Little lived, there's only one thing you could have been talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And these areas, which have grown up a lot in the 40 years since, were actually pretty rural and fairly lightly populated. particularly when you got away from, the handful of major cities and towns.
Mm-hmm.
And a place like Gloucester, Virginia, where he was living, was quite rural. And the Lancaster County area, which you know well, is
Still rural.
it's still rural, but it was even more so
More rural then.
back
Yep.
then. It was farming, it was forestry, it was watermen, as we know with Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. and his family, his older brother in particular.
Yeah, my grandfather, I was thinking about this and I was talking to my dad about this. My grandfather was a waterman, my mom's dad
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
in Lancaster. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So he worked around the northern neck, so both sides between the Middle Peninsula and, up in the Chesapeake Bay, and then would bring his catch up to Staten Island and then
Mm-hmm.
back down. But he would have been on the water right around the time.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, is
Yeah.
he African American?
Yes, yes.
I see. Again, never having lived in Virginia, I think of watermen as white guys, and yet here's an African American guy
Yep.
working on the water right alongside those folks. And maybe it's my limited view of Virginia in the 1980s. There's something I didn't know, that there were black watermen.
Yeah, and it wasn't a scenario where I would say, because I could easily imagine a space where the black people are allowed to fish here, the white people fish here, but that was not the case.
Really?
Yeah, it was wide open. It was you know, it was both every waterman to himself, but also collaborating with each other, being able to say things like, "Hey, I've got my catch, and this is where the oysters are, or this
Right.
is where the."
Interesting.
Yep, yep.
Hmm.
It was one of the places where you probably had some camaraderie, because if you think of my family, as much as we can tell, so my big chunk of my mom's side of the family actually came from Barbados, Bermuda.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
after revolutions there, some are, slaves. There's actually this woman. I know this is an aside, but what I call her is the white woman in our family. She, she came down from Connecticut after the Civil War, right after the Civil War, because she thought black people are going to be free now. It's like, got bad news for you.
We didn't quite get there.
Right. We didn't get there immediately.
No.
But the interesting thing about it, I think, and the thing about that area, as soon as I heard that Wilmer was arrested, it made complete sense to me, coming from a family with a waterman in it, because the
Right.
Northern Neck is not particularly close by road to where this is. But if you're a waterman, you would have been familiar with the Middle Peninsula. You would have been familiar with Norfolk,
Mm-hmm.
and so it just made a lot of sense to me. And as I've told you before, people in my family, my cousins were a generation, they're sort of between me and my parents in terms of age. They even said, the Wilmer boys were known. Alan and his brother Keith, and they were known. And I hate to put it this way, but I'm gonna quote them for context. But you knew to stay away from those crazy white boys.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. No, and this is what I've been told too. And this might make the family somewhat uncomfortable, but all I can reflect is what I've been told in the last couple of years as I've looked into the Wilmer family. And I don't mean to be judgmental or anything like that, but when multiple people tell me this is a family you did not mess with.
Right. I think that's a good place to stop for today. Thanks for joining Bill and I. Next week, we're going to discuss how we suspect the FBI and the Virginia State Police were able to get around DNA restrictions to link murders to Wilmer Sr. We're going to talk about the history of the family's involvement in the cases and how Bill became involved after a leak of crime scene photos from Becky and Cathy's murders. We're also going to talk about the March 1988 murder of 18-year-old Lori Ann Powell, a high school graduate who got out of her car on US Route 17, close to where my family lives, and was found in the James River near Ragged Island. We're going to talk about some speculation that Wilmer Sr. may have been following the couple and then took Powell when the opportunity presented itself. We're also going to talk about the disappearance the next month, in April 1988, of 20-year-old Keith Call and 18-year-old Cassandra Haley, two Christopher Newport students who were leaving a party. Their car was found near the York River. Their disappearances are the only case where bodies have not been found. But the reasons that Bill and I talk about that lead us to believe that their cases may still be solvable. We'll also continue our conversation about the Wilmer brothers and how Wilmer came on the radar screen of law enforcement because of Keith and Cassandra's disappearances in 1988. We'll dive into the fact that law enforcement moved on from Wilmer Sr. and that after that, there were more murders. We'll also talk about a curious link between Wilmer Sr. and a second man, Ron Little, who owned a company called Liberty Security. Liberty also has links to two other victims who work there and to the mother of another victim. We're also going to discuss how these murders might be better called the Peninsula murders in reference to connections between the Northern Neck, the Middle Peninsula, the Virginia Peninsula, and even Southern Maryland and North Carolina. If you would like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us at our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again next week.